Alberta, Calgary, April 25th.
All right, we're stepping into the firearms show. So yeah, I guess I'll just go start talking to some people.
Last week, our producer, Sam Konnert, was in Alberta, while Canadians across the country started to finally tune into party platforms, campaign promises, and even cast early ballots. But in parts of the West, some conversations aren't about who should lead the country, but about something else entirely. Western alienation. And in some cases, separation.
So separation is super top of mind for you.
Absolutely. Becoming 51st state, at least Alberta.
Yeah, so you'd be in favor of joining the U.S.?
100%. 100%. I don't think that people are educated.
Sam heard a growing frustration with Ottawa, anger, and even a loss of faith in Canada itself. All of this is happening at a moment when the country is under the thumb of U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war and annexation threats. One thing is very, very clear. Ottawa is on notice. Polling by Angus Reid has shown that 25% of Albertans would vote yes in an Alberta independence referendum, and that number could climb fast, depending on what happens in the next federal election. And apparently it's not just Alberta we should be worried about. Preston Manning, one of the most recognizable conservative voices in this country, plastered a warning on the pages of the Globe and Mail that this feeling, this movement, could spread to places like Saskatchewan, BC, and Manitoba, depending on who is in power in Ottawa. Quote, the next Prime Minister of Canada, if it remains, Mark Carney, would then be identified in the history books, tragically and needlessly, as the last Prime Minister of a unified Canada. End quote. But look, this isn't the first time whisperings of Alberta separation have been heard. Alberta's threatened to leave Canada twice in the past few years. So is this all overblown? Our Western provinces couldn't just pack up and leave Canada, right? Right? This episode, I'll be checking in with Sam, who's talked to Albertans about their priorities this election. Sam also spoke to Preston Manning, the man behind this conversation, to break down just how serious he thinks this moment is. And later, you'll get a bit of a reality check from Dr. Lisa Young, a political science professor who can help us make sense of the growing feeling of Western alienation and the separatist sentiment. Let's get into it. Sam, you were at a gun show. Why were you at a gun show?
So I was looking for places I could go to talk to some supporters of this movement, and I found out that the Alberta Arms and Cartridge Collector Association was putting on their annual Easter gun show at the Seven Chiefs Arena on the Tsuut'ina Nation that borders Calgary's southwest. And a lot of the organizers and supporters that I found on Facebook were advertising this event, so I thought I would stop by and try and ambush some of them.
So, what'd you find out?
Yeah, so I talked to a lot of people there.
All right, so maybe if you just wanted to introduce yourself and tell me about what you're doing here.
My name is Ashley. I've never been to a gun show before. First time. Yeah.
It's my first time too, actually.
I'm Jane. I love guns.
Tom, and I collect guns.
Madison, just here to check it out.
My name is Sean, and I just come here every year.
Miles, same thing.
Caden, just taking a look at the guns today.
Yeah. How old are you, Caden?
16.
Now, obviously, since I was at a gun show, firearms were a huge factor weighing into people's votes this election.
Got to be honest with you, I'm a one-issue voter. Like, I understand the taxes and I understand the crime, and that needs to all be dealt with. But for coming after my guns and for having them to stand up and said, even like you did in the debate the other day, the solution to crime is guns, and that's not true.
As a woman, it does not feel good to be able to go out and about gunless, so I wish we had more gun rights in that respect.
I mean, unsurprising, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of frustration over guns, but it also just seemed like there's frustration and dissatisfaction over many, many, many things.
I think primarily I'm interested in the economic situation of this country.
Our country's going down the toilet, and for people to sit and say, "Oh yeah, everything's going great. Let's vote them in again," it's ridiculous.
I think we definitely want Alberta and the West to be stronger, especially when people come out here. They want to enjoy our way of life, but then they want to change it. And part of what makes us great is how we live out here.
It's not going to matter who wins the election, I don't think. We're not going to get a fair shake at anything, even if the Conservative government does get in.
And what I heard over and over again is this idea of representation and Western alienation, and it's just an overall feeling that the country doesn't appreciate Alberta.
I actually just voted this morning, and I was thinking as I was voting, no matter who I vote for, does it make a difference in this actual election? Because I'm in Alberta.
We don't have to pay Quebec, which they own underground gas and oil, but they don't want to develop. Rather, they're going to take Alberta money.
What we put out in transfer payments to Quebec, and then they're refusing to put a pipeline through their province. Let's see how long you guys survive.
You know, we talk about equalization payments and all that. I think we definitely want Alberta and the West to be stronger, especially when people come out here. They want to enjoy our way of life, but then they want to change it.
Okay. They said equalization payments. Can you explain those to me?
Yeah, for sure. So it is a bit complicated, and there's a lot of misunderstandings around it. And it's something that I have heard people lament about in Alberta since I was old enough to eat solid food. At its most basic level, it's a system that makes payments to poorer Canadian provinces to equal out their ability to provide services to their citizens. And some Albertans are mad because there's a feeling of hypocrisy that Alberta's oil wealth is being redistributed to a large degree to Quebec. And so the feeling here among some people is that the system only exists to prop up Quebec's finances and keep them happy. And as you may know, Quebec banned oil production in 2022, so now Albertans are mad that Quebec is relying on these transfer payments to fund their social services.
Okay, I get how that can seem unfair.
Totally. There's an idea here that Alberta sends money to Quebec, for example. It's like a bill they pay to fund their cheap daycare or whatever type of service they provide. But that's wrong. What happens is Ottawa collects federal taxes at an equal rate across the country. And it's not so much that Alberta pays more, it's that high-income individuals pay more. And can you guess where a lot of those high-income people live?
Alberta!
So without Alberta's oil wealth, Ottawa would have less tax revenue to redistribute to these have-not provinces. And the Liberal government has locked in this equalization formula until 2029, and it's up for renewal every 5 years. So a new government could theoretically change it in 2029.
This government could change it.
This government could change it, yes. There are reasons to be frustrated. It's been 2 decades since there's been any kind of in-depth review of this. This is the Harper government's formula, with some tweaks here and there. And the feds kind of treat this 5-year reevaluation as a formality. But as the economy grows, the wealth disparity between the provinces is shrinking. So the nearly 70-year-old system is quickly becoming outdated. So completely dismissing any complaint from Alberta or other provinces that there aren't some fundamental flaws in this system, that's misguided. The equalization system is built on decades of compromise and political dealing, and it has lots of room for legitimate criticism.
Okay, I got it.
Good. I know it's complicated.
I love my new Alberta knowledge.
All that being said, there's some legitimate concerns. But I talked to lots of people at this gun show that took this point of view to the extreme, and as you have heard, are seriously considering some sort of Western separation.
Becoming 51st state, at least Alberta.
Yeah, so you'd be in favor of joining the U.S.?
100%. 100%. I don't think that people are educated on the aspects of how beneficial it would be to especially Alberta.
Separation is not just Alberta, also Saskatchewan, which is also gas and oil producer.
Something we're definitely thinking about. Don't know exactly what that would look like, but yeah, I think it's a legitimate conversation. It's on the table, yeah.
No, totally. Yeah, no, definitely. It's like it seems a little bit outlandish, but anything is possible.
And separation, for me, it would be a thought. It would be a thought.
I mean, Canada, as I know it, and as a lot of people that I know, is gone.
How serious are people? Like, how is this even, what would this even look like?
Well, see, that's the thing. Nobody could really give me a straight answer or a cohesive vision for what they'd want. Some people want to join the US. Some people want to join Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Some just want it to be Alberta. There's no one clear spokesperson for this feeling and growing movement, but there's Preston Manning, conservative titan from Alberta, who kind of put it all together in one cohesive, explosive Globe and Mail opinion piece. So I reached out to him for an interview and asked him what prompted that piece.
So I wanted to just alert some voters, particularly in central Canada and Atlantic Canada, who I think don't have any idea that one of the consequences of re-electing the Liberals will be a spike in that secession sentiment and cause a genuine national unity problem right off the bat.
Now, it should be said that he's not outwardly advocating for secession, but he wants a mechanism to make the federal government take these concerns seriously.
You need to provide some kind of democratic forum or container to acknowledge this political energy that'll be boiling up from the bottom. Provide a forum where the various options can be debated and constructively analyze what's their strengths, what their weaknesses. Let these people who think secession or independence is the best route, give them a forum, but a forum where that option will be seriously debated.
He was very clear that this isn't just an Alberta issue, but a Western issue, with Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and even BC feeling the same way. But the data just doesn't back that up. The Angus Reid Institute found 33% of Saskatchewan residents and 30% of Alberta residents would vote in favor of separation, whether to form their own country or join the United States, but that doesn't hold for BC or Manitoba. BC Premier David Eby told a news conference that he thinks Mr. Manning is just seeking clicks and playing to a political base, and he doesn't think there's any credible threat to Canadian unity.
So what are your takeaways from these conversations?
Ultimately, I guess my takeaway from my experience at the gun show and talking to Preston Manning is that there are some serious concerns and frustrations that do need to be addressed. And it's something that's on a lot of people's mind, but the mechanics of how that would happen or what that would even look like have a long way to go.
Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today, Lisa.
My pleasure.
It's interesting because this isn't the first time, as you've said, that we've had this kind of separatist moment in Alberta history. You know, I'm thinking about 2019. I'm thinking about the Wexit movement after the re-election of Justin Trudeau in 2021. But what's different this time around? Is there momentum here?
I think there is momentum. I mean, the idea that the Liberals get elected for a fourth consecutive mandate is going to put pressure on relations with conservative-minded folks in the province. So, that's something that you can imagine building, right? It's frustrating being on the losing side in elections all the time, right? Progressives in Alberta know that. But I think that the other difference here is just the way that Donald Trump has changed the world for us, right? On the one hand, for lots of people in Alberta, this has been a reminder of the value of Canada. But on the other hand, for people who do have these ideas of separation, all of a sudden, you're not just, a voice in the wilderness. You are a voice that might very well be contacted by somebody from south of the border who might see you as potentially being very useful. So all of a sudden, there is external support potentially for this idea. And then we are in a very different situation. But we are in this exceptional moment where we've got an American president who muses about the 51st state, who does not respect rule of law. And so, my nightmare scenario is that there's sort of enough of a public show of support for the idea of Alberta separating that the Americans come to liberate us. And, I've got to be really clear. I'm not predicting that this is going to happen. This is the nightmare scenario. But
yeah,
we're living in a time where some of those nightmare scenarios are actually coming to pass.
Maybe this is a good place to talk about who these separatists are.
There's always one or two sort of further right of center parties in Alberta that are separatist of some sort, right? They keep renaming themselves. There was one that I think was the Buffalo Party, and it's now renamed itself the Alberta Republican Party.
Whoa, interesting choice of words.
Well, yeah, and that was not a coincidence, because their stance is absolutely about, let's exit Canada and join the United States, right? And look, we're all ready to be the Republican Party. So, these are folks who are on the fringe, without a doubt. But they are significant players within the United Conservative Party and within that movement, right? And to be clear, there are the folks who have their own party, and then there's others who've got sort of similar views, who have memberships in the UCP. I think there's some flexibility between them,
Gotcha.
And there's lots of movement on that front. They tend to be people who are quite far right. They generally believe in very small government. They tend to be socially conservative, and have often views in common with sort of the evangelical right in the United States.
And roughly, how many people are we talking here?
The activists, it's a relatively small group. But then the question is public opinion, right? Who actually supports them. When we look at, voting behavior, we don't see a lot of support for these folks, 1 or 2% of the vote. But if you ask the question on a survey, do you think Alberta would be better off if it left Canada? Most of the time, you see between 15 and 20% of people who answer the survey will agree to that. After the 2019 election, when there was this sort of upswing in separatist sentiment because the Liberals had been reelected, it went up to 30% and it went back down pretty quickly. And so I think there's every reason to believe that, if the Liberals are reelected, we'll see the same thing.
I think the best place to start is how seriously you're taking this recent rise in separatist sentiment in Alberta.
Well, I think about this in two different ways. The first way is that if a quarter of the people in a province are so discontented with how things are working in the country that they say that they're ready to leave, that's a serious matter. And I think that we all ought to take that seriously. So I take it seriously from that point of view. But the other way of thinking about this is, should I, as somebody who lives in Calgary, be selling my house because Alberta is about to leave Confederation? That I take a little less seriously. When we think about what would actually be involved in Alberta separating, holding a referendum, having to get a clear answer on a clear question, having to contemplate the idea of actually setting up a whole new country or joining the United States, that's pretty serious stuff. And it's not at all clear to me that the outcome of a referendum like that would be even close. So I'm not packing my bags and fleeing the province. I don't think that anything is going to come of it.
Talk to me a little bit about this moment right now. I'm thinking about Preston Manning's recent Globe and Mail opinion piece where he said a vote for Mark Carney's Liberals is basically the beginning of the end, that Canada should be ready for Alberta to pack its bags. What was your reaction to Preston Manning's piece?
I think we need to think about what he's saying and why he's saying this at this moment. And, he would claim, I think, that this is just his attempt to warn Canada about what's going to happen. He's just stating a fact that there's going to be an uptick in separatist sentiment. And as a fact, that's probably true. We saw this in 2019. I think we probably will see a rise in separatist sentiment if the Liberals win. But when this is coming from, a public figure, someone who has been the leader of a major federal political party, someone who's played a significant role in Canada's political life, it comes across less as an observation and more as a bit of a threat. He's saying this in the midst of an election and basically, I think, trying to say to the rest of Canada, if you don't get this right, we're going to pack our bags and leave. And from the point of view of democracy, this isn't how we do things. There's this idea from political science of losers consent, that in a democracy, you fight hard during an election, but everybody accepts the outcome of the election and then they pick themselves up and they live to fight another day, because in a democracy, there will always be a next time. And this threat that if Alberta doesn't get its way this time around, it's going to leave, really, I think, is not just factually inaccurate, but also undemocratic.
Do you worry that people will doubt the election results because of these kinds of warnings and threats and predictions? The reason I ask is because Preston Manning has said this, and I'll quote him, quote, "You're going to have a major rejection of the legitimacy of that government," end quote. And I think he's saying if the Liberals get elected, there's going to be a rejection of that.
I would interpret what he's saying not as questioning the counting, but questioning the Canadian electoral system. And this is an idea that has deep roots in Western Canada. There's a sense that, elections are decided elsewhere in the country and so that the West doesn't have its say. And, in some ways, I think this is a bit of a hangover from the times when we used to, not have the polls close all at the same time. And so in Western Canada, there was a media blackout because this was before the internet, and, the TV coverage would start in Western Canada and the outcome would be decided. And that really messed with people's heads, understandably, right? I just voted an hour ago, but you've already decided who the majority government is. And so that's one of the regional dilemmas that Canada struggles with. And, you can make a case that our electoral system, it doesn't treat voters in BC and Alberta and Ontario fairly. Their votes have less weight than people in Prince Edward Island or Quebec. And so, there's Preston Manning, through his political career, has wanted to fix Canada to be a democratic system that he sees as being more responsive to the West. And so, back in his Reform Party days when he was running on the slogan of "the West wants in," so when Manning says, that people will question the legitimacy of the government, he's not saying, stop the steal. He's saying the way that we've set up our electoral system and our governing institutions, it doesn't accommodate the West in the way that he thinks it should be accommodated.
Maybe walk me through why Alberta has such a strained relationship with the Liberals in particular. Talk to me about that relationship.
There was a time when Alberta was a Liberal stronghold in federal politics when it was created as a province by the Liberals back in 1905. The Liberals politically owned the place, and then it all fell apart. We've got the added baggage of the conflict between the Alberta government and the federal Liberals under Pierre Trudeau the first time around the national energy policy. And, there was a huge fight about, how to manage Alberta's oil and gas resources. Trudeau brought in the national energy program, and that was seen as an attack on Alberta's control of over natural resources. And so the Liberals became seen as an enemy of Alberta at that time. And that's an idea that, really persists. And, when I first started teaching at University of Calgary in the late 1990s, I would ask my students, how many of you think that the National Energy Program was a terrible thing? And, the hands would all go up. Then I would say, who can explain the National Energy Program to me? Crickets, right? But it's, it's an article of faith, right? And Alberta lives with this boom and bust economy because of oil. And the time just after this conflict, oil prices went down. And so there was tremendous negative economic impact in Alberta. And, people were, I think, traumatized by this in many ways. People lost their houses, and I'm not sure that their anger at the federal government was necessarily well placed in some respects, but there it is. And so this has really, taken hold in the Alberta consciousness. And then when you have another prime minister named Trudeau, who's pursuing policies around greenhouse gas emissions that end up targeting oil and gas production in Alberta, it all comes back. And so you've got another generation of this.
So it all comes back to oil, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to talk about Alberta politics over the last 70 years without talking about oil. The oil industry has really, shaped Alberta's relationship with the federal government in really profound ways.
It's interesting because, I hear you when you say things like, Justin Trudeau and the carbon emissions, and he was a very climate forward prime minister, but he also built a massive pipeline. So how do you juggle, how do you make sense of that? Because I don't know. And I look back and I think it's like, what conservative government has built a pipeline that runs through the country? I'm not sure how to think through that.
Trudeau's record on the oil and gas industry, on energy policy and environmental policy is much less hostile to Alberta than many Albertans would believe. And, this is one of these instances where facts don't necessarily get in the way of people's political beliefs.
So what I'm getting is that it's more of a vibe thing than something explicitly tangible.
I'm not sure it's fair to say it's just a vibe thing, right? I would say that if we go back and look at the Trudeau government in terms of its suite of policies around energy and environment, it's a mixed bag. And, certainly some of the more recent actions around, calling for net zero electricity generation, talking about capping greenhouse gas emissions, those actually have really significant impacts. So, this is not that people are, just sort of making this up. I think it's more that they look at the balance sheet and they heavily emphasize the negative and don't weight the positive, right? In terms of Carney, I think there's suspicion because he is a Liberal. His policy stances up to this point really are much much more generous to the oil and gas industry than Trudeau's were. He has done away with the carbon tax, which was one irritant. He's not going to do away with the industrial carbon tax, but that's been like provincial conservative policy for a long time. So,
Totally.
The notion that this is, some attack on the industry is fairly hard to take. He's not walking away from the question of emissions. So, that's certainly on the, seen on the negative side of the balance sheet for folks who are proponents of the industry. But he's also using Harper's language of making Canada an energy superpower. Now, I suspect that the fine print of his notion of an energy superpower involves the sun and the wind in ways that Harper's might not have. We don't know, because this has been an election full of generalities, right? But
Totally.
But certainly, I do think that we're seeing, a moderation of the Liberals' stance. And it's partially a function of the moment that we're in as well, right? Things that were non-starters, a pipeline across the country are all of a sudden a compellingly important idea, right? Because Trump has changed everything.
This name has come up a few times in our conversation, Danielle Smith. How does she fit into all of this? Because I'm thinking back to that list of demands that she published for our future prime minister to keep Albertans happy. I'll read you just a few of the things on that list. Guaranteeing Alberta full access to oil and gas corridors to the north, east, and west, repealing Bill C-69, aka the New Pipelines Act, lifting the tanker ban off the BC coast, eliminating oil and gas emissions cap, which is a production cap, and the list goes on and on and on and on. How do you read her role in all of this, in this separatist moment?
Anyone who is Premier of Alberta understands that part of their job is to be an advocate for the oil and gas industry. So Smith has really positioned herself as, in the kind of drill baby drill tradition of the American Republicans, that nothing can stand in the way of oil production. And that's a position that wins her significant support electorally in Alberta. You don't lose points necessarily for being an oil absolutist as Premier of Alberta, and it's a position that she's pretty comfortable with.
Went down to Mar-a-Lago to lobby on their behalf.
Has she taken a hit in popularity in Alberta for doing that? No, she has not. She is probably, of the provincial premiers Alberta has had, she is the closest to being separatist. And I don't want to say that she is a separatist. I think of her as being kind of separatist adjacent. She hangs out with people who are willing to talk about separatism. She, her signature piece of legislation when she was running for her party's leadership was the Sovereignty Act. And this was a view that, Alberta should have a new relationship to Canada where we get to opt out of the bits that we don't like. And she's moderated that stance. Her party wouldn't go with her as far as, stepping over the boundary with rule of law. But it's, she has brought her party closer to this sovereigntist stance. And so, I think that helps to explain her less than enthusiastic participation in the idea of Team Canada.
We've seen Pierre Poilievre, trying to distance himself from Danielle Smith's comments and Preston Manning's comments. He's calling for unity in the face of the Donald Trump tariffs, because obviously this separatist talk is clearly a problem for him because, as the future prime minister, you're trying to present this unified front against Trump. But then you have Danielle Smith rallying around Poilievre, saying, you should vote for Poilievre. That's who I'm voting for, while also making him look bad with all this kind of separatist noise. How do you make sense of this contradiction? What the hell is Danielle Smith's plan here? What is she doing?
It is not my job to make sense of Danielle Smith. That's Danielle Smith's job. No, you have, you've pointed to a real tension here, and the incentives that Danielle Smith is responding to in domestic Alberta politics are pretty clear. That you position yourself in opposition to the federal government and as a proponent for the oil and gas industry. And, so she's absolutely doing that. And she's pursuing, ideas that make enormous sense to her base. And she also knows that if you don't keep the base on side in Alberta politics, your career can be cut short. And she knows that because it happened to the last guy, right? Part of what you need to do to keep the base happy is to sort of say, like, rah federal conservatives, right? Even though she's doing things that are not helpful to the federal conservatives. And so it's a dangerous game for her. Smith needs to be aware of the risks here if there's going to be finger pointing after the election about why the Conservatives lost, assuming that they lose.
What if the Liberals gain seats in Alberta? There are a handful of ridings that are going to be a tight race between the federal Conservatives and the Liberals. This is it feels like the first time in recent memory for me that a Western province has been the one to watch. How have you been reacting to seeing those numbers?
Yeah, my morning routine is, check all of the seat projections to see if they've changed, because it's so wild. So right now, the poll aggregators are showing about 30% of Albertans are going to vote Liberal. And the first thing I'm going to say, the best pollster in Alberta, who doesn't do national stuff, she just does Alberta politics, is Janet Brown. And Janet Brown, every morning as I look at the poll aggregator, I've got Janet Brown in my head. And she's saying, in Alberta, most of these polls will underestimate Conservative support. Right. And the reason that she's the best pollster in Alberta is that she uses particular techniques where she goes out and makes sure that she gets certain kinds of people who don't always answer polls. Right. She gets them on the phone and,
nice.
She phones back over and over again to do that. And she's always the pollster who calls it in Alberta elections because of that. Right. And so I'm channeling Janet Brown here to say, I'll believe 30% when I see it the morning after the election.
Thanks for taking the time, Lisa. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's been this episode of Canadian Politics. If you enjoyed, leave a like, a comment, a subscribe, ring the bell, send me an email at noor@canadaland.com. There's a lot of things you could do at this point. April 28th is the day that you can have an actual say in the politics and the democracy and the government around you. So don't waste it. I can't vote, so if you want to vote for me, you can.